Imagine walking into a room full of the most powerful people you have ever seen. Men in expensive suits. Women draped in silk and pearls. Crystal chandeliers hanging above like frozen stars. The air thick with perfume, money, and pride. Now imagine being invisible in that room. Not invisible because you are hiding. Invisible because nobody thinks you are worth looking at. That was Clara Hoffner's life. Every single day. But here is the thing about people who are ignored long enough. They start to listen. Really listen. The kind of listening that most people never learn, because they are too busy talking, too busy being seen. Clara had no choice but to listen. And what she gathered in that silence would one day stop a room full of powerful men completely cold. This is her story. The Warenhaus Imperial Hotel was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small the moment they stepped through its doors. Marble floors that reflected your face back at you. Polished silverware laid out like soldiers on white linen. Waiters who moved so smoothly, they almost seemed to float between tables. Everything in that hotel was designed to say one thing clearly. You either belong here, or you do not. Clara did not belong there. She was 10 years old, small for her age, with blonde hair her mother combed carefully every single morning before the workday began. Her shoes were thin from wear, but polished until they almost shone. Her dress was plain. Her hands were small. And when guests brushed past her, their eyes slid right over her, the way eyes slide over a chair or a curtain or anything that simply exists in the background without demanding attention. She was the waitress's daughter. Nothing more. Nothing less. Her mother, Hilda Hoffner, was the kind of woman whose strength you only understood if you paid close attention. She moved through that hotel with grace and quiet pride, carrying trays heavy enough to strain most people's arms without a single tremor. Her uniform was plain, a white blouse buttoned to the throat, a dark skirt, a small apron tied neatly at her waist. Her face carried the lines of a hard life, early mornings, late nights, years of serving people who rarely said thank you. But her back was always straight. Her head was always high. She had raised Clara alone. And she had raised her well. Clara spent her hours in that hotel perched on a small wooden stool near the back wall, watching. While other children her age were playing outside, she sat with an old phrase book balanced on her lap. It had belonged to her grandfather, its edges frayed, its pages yellowed, the ink faded in places to almost nothing. But to Clara, it was a treasure chest. She would trace the letters with her fingertip. German, French, Latin, Hungarian, her lips moving silently, repeating words she had first heard spoken in a quiet voice by a man who was no longer alive to speak them. Her grandfather had been a teacher. Before the war took everything from his family, he had been a man of books and languages and deep, patient wisdom. When illness came for him in his final years, it was Clara who sat beside his bed in the long, sleepless nights. He could no longer do much, but he could still read aloud, and she could still listen. He would point to the old maps on his wall and say, "Every word is a door, little one. If you can open it, you will never be trapped." She never forgot that. After he died, when she was just 6 years old, the silence he left behind was almost unbearable. So Clara did the only thing that felt right. She picked up his books and kept going. She read in secret, late at night, when her exhausted mother had finally fallen asleep. She stumbled over difficult words. Sometimes the sentences made her cry, not because they were sad, but because they reminded her of his voice. But she kept reading. She kept speaking the words softly into the quiet room, because it felt like keeping a small flame alive. Nobody knew. Nobody thought to ask. She was just the quiet girl on the stool. Invisible. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It started with a raised voice near the reception desk. Sharp, impatient, cracking through the steady hum of the hotel like a stone through glass. A tall man in a navy suit was arguing with the young front desk clerk. His German was broken, each word forced and frustrated, his gestures becoming wider as the clerk stumbled trying to respond. Guests nearby looked up from their meals. Forks paused. Conversations dipped. Clara looked up too, and she heard something that nobody else seemed to hear. Beneath the man's broken German, there was another language breathing. The rhythm of his vowels. The shape of his frustration. She recognized it the way you recognize an old song you haven't heard in years. It rose up from somewhere deep in her memory, from a small room, a flickering lamp, an old man's quiet voice. Hungarian. She slid off her stool before she had fully decided to move. Her small shoes pressed softly against the marble floor. She could feel her mother's eyes finding her from across the room, That familiar gaze that said stay back, don't draw attention. But Clara's feet kept moving. She stepped up beside the reception desk, barely tall enough to see over it, and she spoke. Quietly, carefully, in Hungarian. I think the key is not for your room, sir. May I help translate? The man turned. His mouth closed mid-sentence. His eyes, sharp and frustrated only a second ago, fell on the child standing before him and went wide with surprise. Clara did not flinch. She simply pointed to the brass number on the key, then to the open register on the desk, and explained the mix-up in calm, precise Hungarian. The man's shoulders dropped. The tension left his face. He nodded, took the correct key from the clerk, bowed slightly toward Clara, and walked away without another word. The lobby was silent. Then the whispers began. People leaned toward each other, eyes wide. Did you see that? The waitress's child. She spoke Hungarian. Where did she learn that? Some were amazed. Some were uncomfortable. But every single person in that lobby was now looking at the girl who had been invisible 5 minutes ago. Clara stepped back and folded her hands in front of her. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable. To her, she had simply opened a door that needed opening. Nothing more. But from a corner table, a man in a dark, expensive suit had set down his glass very slowly. His name was Edward Brenner. He was wealthy, sharp-minded, and not easily impressed. He had watched the entire exchange with the focused stillness of someone who had spent decades separating the genuine from the pretend. And something about this child, her composure, the way she stepped back without seeking applause, the way she simply folded her hands as though nothing remarkable had happened, had caught him like a hook. He did not look away. That evening, Brenner approached Clara directly. He asked about her Hungarian, about where it came from, about who had taught her. And Clara told him plainly, without performance or exaggeration. Her grandfather. The books. The long nights. The words kept alive in the dark after he was gone. Brenner listened to every word. Then he made a request. There was a man down the hall, he explained. A Frenchman with a contract he was insisting had been misread. Brenner wanted Clara to listen and tell him the truth of it. Hilda appeared at her daughter's side almost instantly. Her voice was low but firm. If she goes, I go. It was not a question. It was not a request. Brenner accepted with a small nod. They followed him upstairs, through hushed corridors and past tall wooden doors, into a private study lined with books and maps and the warm glow of a fire. The Frenchman was already seated, papers spread before him, his face tight with urgency. He spoke quickly, his hands moving over lines of text, pointing to seals and signatures. His voice carried the pressure of a man who had convinced himself he was right. Clara stood before the table and listened. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes moved carefully over the pages. She did not rush. Then she spoke. The contract, she explained quietly, did not say 5 years. It said 5 months. And here, she placed her finger gently on a line. There was a condition requiring a witness to approve every renewal. That witness was not present. The man's entire claim rested on a misreading, whether accidental or deliberate. The Frenchman's face went pale. His mouth opened, then closed. He gathered his papers with stiff hands and left the room without meeting anyone's eyes. Brenner stood by the fire, still and quiet for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, a bridge built, and strong enough to hold weight. Clara lowered her eyes. It was only the truth, she said softly. Behind her, Hilda stood with her hands pressed hard against her apron, trying to contain something enormous rising in her chest. Pride, relief, and something deeper, the feeling a mother gets when she realizes her child has carried something quietly for years and carried it beautifully, without anyone ever knowing. The fire crackled in the hearth. And in that small, warm room, something had shifted. The girl nobody saw had just been seen. Not by everyone. Not yet. But by the right person at the right moment. And that was enough for now. There is a moment in every underdog story where the world stops pretending it hasn't noticed. Where the whispers get too loud to ignore. Where the people who doubted have to decide, do they admit what they saw, or do they dig in deeper and fight it? For Clara Hoffner, that moment came the morning after. And it came with a chair. The news had moved through the Warenhaus Imperial Hotel the way news always moves through places where powerful people gather. Quietly, quickly, and with just enough distortion to make everyone uneasy. By morning, every guest had heard some version of it. The waitress's daughter. The little girl on the stool. She had corrected a grown man's contract in French. She had spoken Hungarian like a scholar. She had walked into a private study and dismantled an argument that full-grown men of business had not thought to question. Some people were genuinely amazed. Others were deeply uncomfortable. And a few, the ones who had built their entire sense of importance on the idea that knowledge belonged only to people like them, were quietly furious. Into all of this walked Clara, in a simple blue dress her mother had pressed carefully the night before, her worn phrase book held behind her back like a quiet secret. And Edward Brenner was waiting for her at the long table. Not at the far end. Not against the wall. Right beside him. The chair pulled out, waiting, in the middle of the most powerful gathering in that hotel. The reaction was immediate. Guests shifted in their seats. Some frowned openly. Others exchanged glances loaded with meaning. A child at the great table. The waitress's daughter, seated beside Brenner himself, as though she belonged there. Clara paused for just a moment at the edge of the room. Just one breath. Then she walked forward, climbed into the chair with quiet composure, and folded her hands neatly on the table. Her feet did not reach the floor. Her dress was plain among all that silk and tailoring. But her back was straight, and her eyes were steady, and she looked at no one with apology. Hilda stood just behind her, as she always did. Back straight. Face unreadable. Hands folded against her apron. She did not belong in this room, and she knew it. But her daughter was in it, and so she would stand there until the walls came down if she had to. Brenner spoke first. He told the gathered men and women simply and directly that the previous night, this child had corrected a mistake that many of them would not have noticed. He asked them to listen to her, not as a child, but as a mind worth hearing. A man in a dark green jacket cleared his throat. His voice carried the particular tone of someone who has decided to be unimpressed before anything has even happened. "She is 10 years old," he said. "With respect, what insight can a child offer?" Clara turned her pale eyes toward him. She did not raise her voice. She did not flush with embarrassment. She simply said, "I am 10, yes. But I can hear what you cannot." When words shift, when meaning is bent, silence teaches you more than most people will ever speak. The table went quiet. Even the green jacket man said nothing for a moment. Because there is a particular kind of silence that falls when a child speaks with more steadiness than the adults around them. It is uncomfortable. It demands something from you. It asks you to look at yourself. He was not ready to do that. Not yet. The real test arrived without warning, the way real tests always do. A courier entered the hall, dusty from travel, hat in hand. He crossed the room quickly and handed Brenner a sealed document. Brenner broke the seal and read it in silence. Something shifted in his expression. A tightening around the eyes. A stillness that the people who knew him well would recognize as concern. He laid the document in front of Clara. "Read it aloud," he said. The room reacted immediately. Someone laughed under their breath. Others frowned. The green jacket man leaned back in his chair with the small smile of someone expecting failure. Hilda's hands gripped her apron strings. Her lips pressed together. But she did not speak. This was her daughter's moment, not hers. Clara picked up the paper. It was a military report, dense and deliberately coded, the kind of language designed to be understood only by those already deep inside a world of strategy and consequence. Not the kind of thing anyone would ever place in front of a 10-year-old girl. She read it once silently, her lips still, her eyes moving carefully across every line. Then she lifted her chin and began to read aloud. Her voice was soft, but it carried. Every word precise. Every phrase delivered without stumbling, without hesitation. The room that had been ready to mock her went slowly, uncomfortably still. Then halfway through she stopped. She frowned at the page. "Read a single line again." Then once more. "This word is wrong," she said quietly. She placed her finger on the page. "It says reinforcement. But this stroke here, it has been changed. It is not natural. Someone altered it. The original word is retreat." The silence that followed was the loudest silence that room had ever held. Brenner leaned forward slowly. Clara continued, her voice steady as river stone. "If you act believing reinforcements are coming, you will wait. You will hold your position. But if you understand that this word means retreat, you will move. You will act before it is too late." Nobody laughed now. The green jacket man's face had gone the color of old ash. His mouth was slightly open. Whatever he had come to that table expecting, it was not this. Brenner rose from his chair. He looked around the table slowly, letting the silence breathe, letting every person in that room sit with what they had just witnessed. Then he said, quietly but with complete authority, "Now you see why she sits at this table. But one moment of proof is never enough for people who have already decided not to believe." That evening, before Clara and Hilda could leave, they were called back into a small chamber lined with shelves that smelled of dust and age. An ancient land document had been found misfiled, its edges brittle and its script so old-fashioned that no one in that hotel had been able to make full sense of it. The green jacket man saw his opportunity. He stood at the edge of the room and pointed toward Clara with the particular confidence of someone who believes they are about to win. "Let the child prove herself," he said sharply. "If her tongue is so gifted, let her untangle this." It was not a genuine invitation. It was a trap dressed as a challenge. He wanted her to fail. Publicly. Completely. He wanted the room to see her stumble, so that everything from the night before could be quietly dismissed as coincidence or luck. Clara stepped toward the table. The parchment lay unfolded before her, its handwriting looping and faded, the dialect centuries removed from anything modern. She leaned close and studied it in silence. Nobody rushed her. Even her enemies waited. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and unhurried. "This is not a contract of debt, as has been claimed," she said. "It is a land grant with conditions. The family named here retains their rights unless the land was abandoned for 3 consecutive years. That has not happened. The claim against them is false." A steward who had been quietly cross-referencing against his own notes looked up from the page. His face had gone pale. "She is correct," he said. The green jacket man did not speak. His jaw worked slowly, like a man chewing on something he cannot swallow. The trap he had set had closed around him instead. Brenner's cane tapped once against the floor. Just once. But in that silence it sounded like a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. "Not impossible," he said evenly. "Proven. By the child you sought to belittle." Later, when the chamber had emptied and only a few people remained by the dying fire, Brenner turned to Clara and asked her to speak. Not to translate. Not to read. Just to speak, in her own words, to the people still in that room. Clara stood small among them. She clasped her hands together, and she spoke from the only place she knew how to speak from. "The truth. I didn't come here to prove anything," she said softly. "My mother works. I sit quietly. We are only noticed when we are in the way. But words matter. Spoken wrongly, they can take what does not belong to the speaker. Heard rightly, they can give back what was lost." She paused, looking at the floor for just a moment, then back up. "I am not special. I was taught to listen, to be careful, to respect what others ignore. But sometimes what is ignored holds the truth." The fire crackled. No one filled the silence with noise. A woman near the back of the room pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. The green jacket man stood at the edge of the group, not looking at Clara directly, but not walking away either. Even he could not fully resist what her words had done to the air in that room. Brenner said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Out of the mouths of the overlooked, truth often arrives." They left the hotel late that night, mother and daughter, walking side by side through cool evening air that smelled of rain and chestnut trees. The streets were empty. The grand hotel glowed behind them, its chandeliers still burning for guests who would never know what had happened that day. Hilda's apron was still creased from a full day's work. Anna's dress was plain, its hem brushing her shoes. But neither of them walked like people who were small. Beneath a chestnut tree in the quiet square, Hilda stopped and knelt down until her eyes were level with her daughter's. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at her. The way mothers look at their children when words feel too thin to carry what they feel. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded note. Brenner had pressed it into her hand as they left. A few careful words of thanks, written in his steady hand. She held it out to her mother. "It belongs to you too," she said. Hilda took it. She pressed it to her chest, closed her eyes for just a moment, and then she pulled her daughter close. No grand words. No speeches. Just a long, quiet embrace beneath the soft glow of a street lantern, while the whole city slept around them. And in that stillness, something settled. The kind of settling that happens after a long storm finally passes. The knowledge that dignity is not something anyone can grant you or take from you. That truth does not shrink to fit the size of the person speaking it. That the child nobody saw had walked into a room full of power and noise and had simply quietly been herself. And that had been more than enough. Some of the most important voices in any room are the ones nobody thought to listen to. If this story moved you, Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, the next time you pass someone by without a second glance, you might just be walking past the one person in the room who actually understands what is going on. Clara's story is finished. But somewhere out there, another quiet child is still listening, still waiting, still learning every word.